Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see all
Good
of
morning.
the wonderful regulars that come to these programs. It's so good to have you all here. So I'm leading this talk today, and what I wanted to do was explore the idea of memorial, sort of as a nod to Memorial Day having been on Monday, and thinking about memorial a little bit broadly at the beginning about just sort of relating to rituals of funerary rites and how we commemorate death. And then we'll look at three works that are a little bit more specific to sort of the military connotation of Memorial Day. So what I'll do without further ado is I'll start to share my PowerPoint. This is always the moment of truth. See if it works. Are you all seeing that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Yep, got
Sculpture, yes.
So it's such a small group today that feel free to just jump in. I like these to be conversational. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts and your ideas. So one of the beauties of these virtual programs, of course, I miss seeing all of you in person, but something that's really neat is that we can draw on works that are not actually currently on view in the museum and make these connections between different elements in the collection. So today we're going to start with an ancient piece and we're going to end with a contemporary photograph. So we're going to span the history of humankind, looking at this idea of memorial. So, I always like to throw it to you first. As you're looking at this image, what are the first things that come to mind? Does it remind you of anything? Does it seem familiar in any way or strange?
Sort of a pawnbroker look.
Yes.
A pawnbroker?
A person in trade. It looks like, is that some kind of a counter in his right hand? And then, of course, we have money, I think, in that stack. A merchant, maybe?
Okay. So thinking about a merchant or somebody in trade, and you're looking specifically at this item here in the hand that maybe is a counter or something that has to do with weighing or keeping track of weight or money or
First
counting.
impression, yes.
And then the pouch here looks to be a money pouch, and you're absolutely right that it would have been a coin pouch there. So interesting, yeah. So perhaps someone in trade. What else can you perhaps guess about this figure?
Well, his beard and his hair are reminding me of the Greek statues. So maybe to build, he's a Greek moneylender.
Okay. And so
Or a
Mary,
wealthy
you were
Greek.
saying his hair and his beard remind you of Greek statues or Greek imagery.
The style, yes. It's reminding me of the portrayals of Zeus and all those guys.
Okay, so it sort of has a Greek god aesthetic, right? With the very stylized beard and then this element at the top of the crown of his head.
Just those, yes.
Anything
but
else?
Of course, Zeus would never carry a pouch of money like that. Someone would be walking behind him with all his coffers.
Someone would do it for him, yeah. So maybe this isn't a god per se. He's got to carry
Definitely not a god.
Fair enough.
A happy Greek.
A happy Greek man. Okay. What else? Any other thoughts about what this reminds you of or any sort of connotations that you have?
It seems to be emerging from an urn of some kind. I wonder what the rest of that fragment would have looked like. It reminds me of one of the statues I saw of river gods, and there was an overturned urn and then a little cat peeking out. And so he seems to be peeking out of some kind of a cast enclosure, but we don't know what the entire thing would have looked like.
Yeah, so good point, Ingrid. So you're noticing sort of the formation from which he's emerging or seems to be set against. And I'm interested in the fact that you referenced a river god. Very often we see these ancient river gods sort of reclining with, one hand, supporting their head. And he almost seems to be in a bit of a reclining pose here. So yeah, definitely reminds us of other images of ancient figures, ancient river gods. And then you mentioned that it almost looks like he's next to it, something that could be like an urn, a fragment of an urn or something like that.
Yeah, it would be interesting to know what the entire backdrop looked like if it were all intact as it was originally created.
He looks happy enough.
Self-satisfied. He looks self-satisfied to me.
Okay, so happy or self-satisfied, and tell me what it is you see that makes you say that.
The self-satisfied aspect is in his mouth and his expression. And even his pose, the way he's
Nonchalant.
propped his head with his hand.
So he's
a
sort of
little.
nonchalant. He's got a little bit of a smile there. He seems relaxed, self-satisfied. I like that. Any other observations or comments about this figure? Okay, so we've guessed a little bit about maybe who this might be. Everyone sort of circled in on this idea that it reminds them of an ancient figure or ancient statuary that you've seen. And this is actually a fragment. Oh, and I didn't put the culture here. It's from our Cypriot collection from the island of Cyprus. We don't have an exact date on it, and maybe about 300 BCE, so very, very ancient. And like I mentioned, it comes from the island of Cyprus. And so Cyprus is this really interesting geographical area. And I've got a map of it here, and we can go back to these details in just a moment. So this is, the Mediterranean here. This is Cyprus. And so I've got the close up here.
The turtle.
Yeah, it looks kind of like a turtle.
Looks like a turtle.
And so it's this really interesting mix of cultures. It was managed, or I guess conquered, by other, various civilizations over the years. So we see Greek influence, Near East influence, ultimately Turkey stakes a claim to it. So it's this confluence, it's this really important geographic region where various cultures kind of meet and intersect, and they all create this really interesting blend or hybrid of what we now know as Cypriot aesthetics and culture. So the references to maybe a river god or someone Greek, absolutely right. Something that's sort of uniquely Cypriot about the aesthetics of this piece is the way that the fabric is portrayed. The Greeks at this point in time would probably have been making their fabric look a little more naturalistic, but here it's these linear stylized lines. So even though there are these elements that remind us of Greek statuary, it's sort of uniquely Cypriot in a lot of ways. Something that I wanted to mention too, thinking about this pastiche of different cultures, is this headdress here, this sort of crown. Mary, I think you mentioned it reminded you of Greek figures, and it absolutely, he would have borrowed this from Greek culture. It's basically a wreath on his head. So that absolutely in the style of Greek culture. But the bowl that he's got, do I have a close-up of it? Maybe not. This drinking cup is actually what he's holding, and it's been chipped away over the years, so it's hard to make out. But that's actually a Persian-style drinking vessel. So he's already got this combination of different styles in the accoutrement that this man has here. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the context of this object and how it relates to memorials. So this is a funerary stele or grave marker, and it's again a fragment. But how is this maybe different similar to what you would expect from a funerary marker or a grave marker? What about this seems funerary to you, and what about it maybe doesn't?
Well, is it the whole figure, or is he broken off?
He's somewhat broken off, yeah. So this is the piece that we have, but especially around the edge here, the top and over on this side, there would have been additional pieces to him. So you're just seeing a fragment here.
What you normally expect to see with these funerary pieces are things that a person would take with them into the afterlife. And you typically wouldn't expect to see figures smiling. So, which this figure does appear to be smiling. So, I mean, can you imagine going to visit the grave of a loved one, and there's this piece above, and he's smiling? It's happier in death than in life. I don't know.
Ingrid, that's a really good point. It goes back to, I think, Betty and Jim's comment that he seems sort of self-satisfied. So he's not tragic, right? He's not this very sad figure that evokes pathos, but instead he's sort of happily there in death represented.
Irish.
Well,
He's taking his money with him. He's taking his money with him, maybe.
And his wine cup. So who wouldn't be happy?
If it's
His
wine,
money and his
he's celebrating. I didn't think of that could be a wine goblet at first, but
Yeah. No, and it's interesting. Like I think you made the point, Ingrid, that usually you take things with you to the afterlife that you would need. And so he does have his money pouch, and probably there would have been other items in the tomb, vessels and things like that he might have needed in the afterlife. But what we see here, and the reason that he's so happy, he's actually sort of reclining, participating in this banquet. So it's sort of a celebration. And, you know, that would probably explain the relaxed pose and the smile. And what's really interesting about Cypriot culture is that the funerary spaces were very close to the living spaces. So the burial area was outside of, you know, the town, but within walking distance. And so we think probably that people would have come and actually had banquets, living people, sort of in association with the dead. So he's here participating in the banquet that the living would have also been participating in. So it was a way to sort of stay connected to the deceased and sort of continue to have them a part of your family or part of your circle.
Sort of
And
a
again, I would love
precursor
to know what the other kind of broken off elements are. We can assume his body sort of goes like this off to the side as he's reclining. And that's very Greek. We see that in a lot of the tomb paintings in ancient Greece of people sitting around having, you know, like symposia or banquets and reclining and drinking wine. So that's, again, that Greek influence there.
a bit of a precursor to the idea of funerals being a celebration of life.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I like to start with our talk on memorials today. Just this idea of how do you memorialize someone? How do you commemorate them? How do you celebrate the life? And I loved this idea of this sort of liminal space that these burial areas in Cyprus existed as, where people would come and sort of continue to engage with the dead in some way through these banquets and sort of continue to honor them and keep their memories alive.
And that's what we kind of do anyway, isn't it?
It is. I mean, in some ways, right, that serves very similarly to any sort of gravestone or grave marker that you continue to return to and visit and pay homage to.
But even in your head, I mean.
Oh, yeah, even in your head. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, you know, there's a new series, this is a slight aside, but kind of tied to it. There's a new series on Acorn about a photographer, I think, in Europe in the Victorian era. And apparently what people would do is they would pose for portraits with their loved ones when they had died. And they would dress them up in their best clothes. And then you would have this portrait of yourself with your dead loved one that you would keep in your living room.
Yeah, I think there's something so poignant about that, just wanting to hold on to that
yes,
connection
of
to the
course.
person. And you know, it's so interesting how we see it manifest over millennia and in different cultures, but with the same general gist.
We want to keep those people with us. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Reborning at the urbanite.
Yeah.
That's right.
So I wanted to just share a little bit about the Cypriot Collection. How many of you are familiar with the Ringling Cypriot Collection in one way or another?
Yes.
Where is it?
Well, that's the thing. Right now, it's not
It
very
doesn't have a
visible.
home.
If you're in the Center for Asian Art on that sort of the long loggia walkway, there are some pieces. This object is not currently on view, but we have a collection of over 2,000 objects. And so I just wanted to share a little bit about the history of that before we move on to our next work, because it's pretty fascinating. It came from ultimately this man, I think his name was Luigi Palma de Cesnola. And he went over to Cyprus and excavated so much ancient objects and things like this. You could call it tomb robbing, you could call it excavating. The practices were a little blurred at the time. This was in the late 1800s. And he brought all of this back and ultimately ends up gifting it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And then probably reciprocating, they make him the first director of the institution. But these, 35,000 objects, an incredibly massive collection of Cypriot objects. And at the time too, they thought about archaeology a little bit differently, where they thought that if you had one drinking vessel, you had 10, they're all the same. Now today, archaeologists realize there's no such thing as duplicates. Each object has a specific find location and a specific history. So no two objects are the same, but back in the day, they thought, well, we have duplicates of everything, let's sell some of it off. And that's where John Ringling comes in. That's when he purchased, I think it was about 2,300 objects from this collection that was originally housed in the Met and brings it back to the museum in Sarasota. So we're still one of the largest holders of ancient Cypriot objects today. The Met still has the biggest collection. They didn't sell off everything. But it's been visible and less visible over the years, depending on which spaces and galleries have been available. But we're currently working on getting a whole gallery dedicated to these objects. So there's more to come on this. And it's really, really fascinating and really incredible that we have these objects that are thousands of years old. So any questions about the Cypriot collection or this object specifically?
Well, I hope we get to see it on view soon because I think it's terrific.
It is. It's really cool. It's really cool. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
I think people will be really excited by it.
So will it be a permanent space and you'll have a revolving exhibit?
Yeah, it'll be a permanent space. Right now, the plans are that it will go in Gallery 12, which is currently that empty gallery between the original MOA galleries and the Center for Asian Art. So it'll be sort of that connector. And I don't think it'll rotate a whole lot because some of the objects are big, they're all stone and heavy, but it'll be a really comprehensive display and give you a sense of all the different things we have in the collection. So really exciting. Yeah.
And you'll give a gallery talk when it's installed.
I will get a curator to give a gallery talk when it's installed. Yes, I will defer to the experts on that one. But yes, we will do a lot of programs once that's up and running.
Wonderful, thank you.
So let's switch
his
gears
posture
completely.
His posture
ahead.
makes sense. Well, I just say his posture makes all the sense in the world if you think of him reclining off to the rest of his body off to the left, our left.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
it helps flesh that out once you can
with a
imagine.
drinking vessel, yes.
Yeah, holding up his drink, having a relaxing pose. Got his money pouch there. He's ready, ready to party. So I want to switch gears completely and go to an old favorite. Oh, that's not that. Here we go. Many of you are familiar with this work, but again, thinking more sort of in the Memorial Day sense in the way that it's commemorated in the United States, it's a holiday to, think about those who have perished in the military serving their country. And so I wanted to, again, this is not an American military service person, but bring it back to that idea of having served your country and sort of commemorating what that experience was like. So if you've been on gallery talks with me before, I love this portrait because I think it's so complicated and such an interesting dynamic. And I love to kind of, parse out the who, what, where, when, and why of this portrait. So let's get started. Who is the who in this? Who are the main characters? Who are the main figures here?
I'm not answering because I've heard your talk several times.
We'll make this one quick because I know some of you have talked about this painting a lot with me.
Yeah, John Manners, his servant, and the horse as the three main characters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you have this really interesting dynamic, and something that people always remark on is once they notice that John Manners, the man here, is elevated on a little bit of a hill because the horse and his page are much taller. So to be given his due and his proper place of importance, he's been a little bit elevated. But I think this is a painting by Joshua Reynolds, one of the finest masters of any country, but especially in England where he worked. And the way that the space is configured is so interesting. You have this sort of this triangle, and no one, including the horse, is looking at the other, but your eye just sort of moves from figure to figure, and you get totally caught up into this powerful dynamic. Can anyone make out what's going on in the background? And you all may know, but it's a little bit hard to see. I've got a detail, and this is something that's kind of cool with, using PowerPoint. Oh, go ahead.
There's smoke. There's smoke in the background, like a war area.
Yeah.
Look at that.
Yeah, so you would never be able to get this close in the gallery, so it's kind of cool. But this is the bottom left there, and you've got these soldiers, other horses, and then this really active battle scene. You can see these horses who have been felled, and there's smoke, like you mentioned. They're charging ahead. They've got their swords up in the air. So it's this intense battle scene. But then when you go back to the expressions of the three main figures, I mean, I guess we can exclude the horse. He probably is not super aware of what's going on.
I'm sure he is.
Well, he may be. Yeah, he seems like a pretty savvy animal. I mean, how do you reconcile sort of this expression with the active battle scene that's going on in the background?
He's above it. He's like, I'm above that.
So for you, it's sort of this high-minded. He's above it, and he literally is above it, but sort of above what's going on.
Literally and figuratively. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Any other interpretations, the way you read his expression there?
He seems to be in contemplation, quite serious, perhaps even a little wistful. And if you look at the three main characters, they're so precisely painted. And when you look at the battle scene, it's a little unclear, shall we say, a little fuzzy. So it does give the impression that perhaps it's not in the same time period, maybe a memory.
Ah, I like that, Ingrid. So you're reading a little bit of wistfulness into his face, and then you're wondering if maybe there's a literal separation between the battle scene in the background, as though it's a memory, something that he's thinking about, lost in thought, rather than them actually, you know, being posed in this moment and meant to be sort of placed in real time in that battle. Interesting. I like that. Yeah.
Well, I'd say I'd add to that. It's kind of the battle version of painting someone's portrait near a window, and outside you see their land and their fields and everything that's a part of them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I would go with what Ingrid is saying and go even further and say, you know, this background is in celebration of him in that moment.
Okay, so yeah, thinking about, well, when people get their portrait painting, they're very deliberate in, you know, their gesture, their expression, their costume in the background, because that can reveal a lot about who that person is. So you're saying that he's very deliberately chosen this background, and it has something to say about who this man is.
And about the portrait specifically, yes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I think most of you are probably familiar with sort of the backstory of this, but I'll fill you in so that we're all on the same page. So this figure here, John Manners, Marquess of Granby, was a British army leader, as we can probably guess from the way that he's so richly dressed and has this beautiful war horse. And this is, he fought in the 7 Years' War. He led his troops, and he led them to a sort of come from behind victory in the Battle of Vellinghausen against the French. And the French troops in that battle were being led by actually one of his friends and colleagues. So they found themselves pitted against each other in war, but before the war, they had, you know, been very friendly with one another. So John Manners here leads his troops to victory, defeats his friend, you know, currently enemy in the war, but his ultimate friend. And then when this is all said and done, he has this portrait. This is a life-size portrait, larger than life, and sends it to the defeated French friend. So it's always interesting how people react to that. Some people think it's a really snarky move. Some people think it's a genuine gesture of friendship. And I'm curious how you all read that. The idea that you would commission this portrait of a battle where you defeated your friend handily and then send him a picture of it.
Well, the word is handily, isn't it? Because
are you Mary? Are you talking about his hand here?
The fact that he has one hand without his gloves on.
Mm-hmm.
So it shows an expression of friendship, perhaps despite the outcome of the battle.
So for you, you're sort of alluding to the fact that he's got his bare hand there as though he would shake his friend's hand. You could
correct, rather than being more formally dressed with his gloves
mm-hmm.
on.
Sure, yeah, and he also has a bare head as well. You know, there's some informality there too.
And I don't see a sword, but maybe I just can't see it.
There's a little bit of I think there's a little bit of a hilt here. I should have had a detail of that. But right, he's not grandstanding by any means.
No.
No.
And if you look at his posture, he's standing there facing us, and yet the battle is in the background. So he's more or less saying the battle is behind us. He has his hand ungloved, almost as if to extend it in friendship. Maybe saying the battle's behind us. He's looking very serious and wistful, perhaps sad to have had to fight his friend on that day, and wishes to resume friendship now that the war is over and behind them.
So yeah, I like how you're thinking about, you know, the positionality of the figure here. The horse is facing the battle, but the man has turned his back on it. So maybe he's saying it's behind us. So given that, that if we're reading this as sort of a gesture of, you know, let's put this behind us, how does this painting function as a memorial in some way? And if so, to what? You can disagree with me. Just because the theme is memorial, it doesn't mean you have to agree. But if you kind of think about it, does it function as a memorial?
Not for me, no, not at all.
Not at all.
No.
So how do you interpret it then?
It's just, you know, a general, you know, posing for a portrait just for himself and eventually sending it to his friend. But I don't think it's under the background of death. I don't think so. It's just has nothing to do with death in my mind.
So for you, it's just much more about setting the stage.
Face, Bob says in your face, I won. I don't think so.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, are you calling a memorial only something to do with death?
I think it can be a little, I think in this context, maybe it's a little more broad.
Perhaps this is a memorial to his military career and the battle that was perhaps most important to him, largely because of the person who was leading the opposing forces.
Mm-hmm.
So it might be a memorial to an event in his military career.
So yeah, maybe just capturing this important moment and memorializing that in a way more so than the death that you mentioned. I think, that it doesn't really seem to be very involved or concerned about what might be happening on the battlefield, right? It's not necessarily about the death of the other soldiers in any way, but maybe it's about the battle itself, or even just this particular moment in time when he had to make this difficult, or maybe it wasn't difficult, but he had to face, a former friend in battle.
Memorializing the fact that he won.
Could be, yeah, it could be a little bit more celebratory, right? Like, I won this battle. Let's make a larger than life portrait and commemorate that. Could be
A bit of a trophy in that case, yes.
It does feel a little trophy-like, doesn't it? Yeah, yeah. And when you see the painting in person, it is very overwhelming.
Yeah.
Friends do compete.
Friends do compete. That is very true.
And the other thing is, of course, it was the business of war.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like if two friends play in the same tennis tournament. One might win, but they still go back to being friends afterwards.
Right.
Hopefully.
Well, place it at the point in history that it's reasonable to say that the French and the English at the time of that battle were not exactly best of friends.
Yeah.
So amazing that those two were.
Yeah. And maybe in a sense, it's sort of meant to celebrate that sort of unlikely friendship, as these two countries were totally pitted against one another. So it could be any number of things, but I think no matter how you read it, I think there's sort of a psychological intensity in spending time thinking about this person and the motivations for this painting and how it may have been received when it was sent over to the French general.
Yeah, Laura, Darlene Zimmerman put in the chat something that I didn't hear, I don't think, but she put, I feel like it's memorializing his victory. His ungloved hand represents how easy it was and seems like bragging.
So sort of braggadocious that I can do it with one hand, with one glove off, I'm just here casually standing, looking off to the distance. It was easy. It was a hand. Yeah. I like that. That exposed hand, reading it in that way.
It is rather boastful, the whole thing, I have to say.
It is,
but it was different. It was a different time, I know that a little bit later in history, people often sent images of themselves to others for many reasons. So what I find really interesting is the height of his assistant, because when you look, you see that Manners is standing on the rock. That is a very tall horse, yet the boy, and he is pretty young, is also very, very tall. And I don't know if Reynolds has distorted his height for that triangular shape of the faces.
Mm-hmm.
I've always wondered that.
Yeah, and I think my guess would be that perhaps he did, just because of the way the composition is so perfect with the three heads here. And it may have been a little bit of artistic license. And I do want to give some agency to this figure here. He's often overlooked, but he was not someone who worked for John Manners. He actually worked, from what we can tell, in the employ of Joshua Reynolds, the painter, and it appears in several other of his paintings as well. So rather than this be sort of an accurate depiction of who was working for this man at the time, he's been included by the artist, and probably, again, for that compositional element, but also just to add some, pomp and circumstance to the scene. And that's, I would love to know more kind of about this young man's story, and hopefully that's something that we can continue to research and uncover.
Someone might know it, especially from Reynolds' correspondence and everything relating to his studio. Yep.
We'll have to do some more digging. All right, any last comments about this one before we move on to our next work?
It's amazing how many people look at this painting, and when you ask what they think of this man, what he's trying to say, many of them focus on the horse's rump and say that he's a bit of a horse's beauty, shall we say?
And I wonder, that is certainly one interpretation. Yeah, could be. So maybe we'll leave it with that. And where's this image of war is sort of like we talked about, maybe a little braggadocious, a little haughty, or maybe, you know, just putting the war behind us. The next painting I want to look at really gets into the gritty reality of a battlefield. So let's see if I've got, oh, well, there's your detail for you again. So we'll move on to our next work here. So this painting has been newly installed in Gallery 21. I guess we've all been away from the museum for 2 months now, but how many of you have had a chance to see it in person yet?
Yes, absolutely.
It's incredible.
Yes.
Yeah, and this slide really does not do it justice. But whether you've seen it in person or if you're just seeing it now on the slide for the first time, I want you to just take a moment and think about one word that you would use to describe this painting, just one word.
Cold.
And you can either put it into the cold. Okay, cold. Okay, cold. Yes, but like what other words might you use as you continue to look at the details here? And I'll click through a couple of details for you, so you can get a better sense of the close-up. I just want to spend a moment kind of looking here, and then we'll go back. And again, these are, you know, these close-ups are things that are a little bit harder to see in the galleries, but are just really
Melee.
Yeah, the cold is coming through for me really, really loud and clear here, especially with the way that the trees seem to just be so brittle.
So I would say it's very in the moment. It's as though it were one of those images from a war zone on the front page of a newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
So for you, it feels very in the moment, as though it's a snapshot of life as it's happening, the kind of thing that would be, you know, sent to the front page of the newspaper.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, and what was it about, what gave you that sense of immediacy or that sense of it being a slice of life?
Well, you actually helped when you zoomed into what was happening in the background, because we've got these guys at the front.
Mm-hmm.
The ones at the front, I think they're dead or pretty badly injured. You've got a horse falling down, but in the back, on your left front screen now, this looks like an officer, I believe.
Here.
And then behind him, you see others. Some look as though they're running away. Some look as though they're regrouping. There's a lot of action, and it's not all together.
Mm-hmm.
And that reminds me of what I've read. It was like in war during those times. And someone has very cleverly captured all these different scenarios within the bigger scene.
Yeah, and I like that point you made, Mary, about how it's not, there's a lot of things happening at once, whereas the painting we just looked at was so very carefully posed and composed and even artificial in a lot of ways. This feels much more real. And I think someone else was talking and I cut you off. I'm sorry, go ahead. Maybe not. Any other reactions to this image as you're continuing to look at it? What other words come to mind?
It's one of those paintings that the more you look, the more you find.
Mm-hmm.
There's just so much going on in the painting, and trying to understand exactly what it is you're seeing is quite interesting too, because your idea of what you're looking at changes as you look around different parts of the painting.
Mm-hmm.
One color.
Horrible day.
And a conversation I've had about this painting with people is this sort of debate about the background. Is that haze? Is that smoke? Is it, is that coming from the cannon, or is there a fire burning? And does that sort of explain the glow in the sky? Is it snow blowing? And I'm curious what you make of sort of the atmosphere of this painting. How are you interpreting that? I mean, we all said cold as the first word, so definitely we're getting that chill, but how else would you describe kind of the environment that's depicted here?
The fog of war.
The fog of, ooh, that sums it up pretty well. The fog
That
of
would be
war.
a really good title for the whole painting.
That would be, and the actual title is just, let's go back. Just French artillery, so I'll suggest to Sarah that we rename it The Fog of War.
I think you should.
Yeah. And
There
does
seems
anyone
to
else
be
have any
smoke
comments?
above the cannons, so I think it's in the midst of battle.
Mhm.
And in fact, if you look behind the soldiers that are lying on the ground in the front to the cannon behind and the men around it, and you see those boxes on the ground, it looks like it's spent artillery shells, perhaps, or the cases for spent artillery shells. So it does appear that that cannon has been fired, and you see the smoke rising above the cannon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
You know,
Okay.
sorry, I was going to say, if it weren't for the horrible scene, it's a really beautiful painting. If you put cows in there instead of people falling in battle.
Yeah, if we just look at the top half.
Scene.
Yeah, no, it is. It really, in the way it's so crisp, the way that the artist has painted, especially those trees. It's beautifully rendered, but then, right, you look at the details. And I love this painting just as a foil to the Marquess of Granby that we just looked at, where, you know, there's a battle going on and there's some smoke in that one too, and there are soldiers in formation and maybe they're a little bit out of line, but here you really get a sense of that visceral chaos and that sense of panic and the chill of, you know, not only the physical cold, but just what has been wrought on these people. And I wanted to share a little bit about the artist. It's Edward de Taille. He was a French artist, and he came from a military family actually, but was always interested in becoming a painter. And he studied with Smithsonian. And he was, as a young man, traveling in Spain and Algeria, but then the Franco-Prussian War broke out in 1870 between, you know, what ultimately is Germany and France. And he came back and enlisted. And so he was sort of on the front lines and got to see firsthand what war was like, and then took that back to his artistic practice and really made his whole career out of documenting the very real atrocities of war. So there's nothing glamorous about this. There's nothing incredibly heroic, but it's from the perspective of someone who lived it firsthand. So it's not this romanticized depiction, but it's not necessarily, I would argue, not necessarily a condemnation of war either, because like I mentioned, he came from this military family. He was active in the military, took a great interest in the military. It's just more sort of a depiction of reality. And Mary, I think that goes back to your comment that this is something that could be on the front page. And so if you're interested in learning more about this artist, he's done a lot of these works, and some of his other paintings are even almost more photorealistic. They just seem so real. So if you Google him, and I've got his name here for you all the way back, it's really interesting to look at his work. And I'm not someone who's particularly interested in images of war, or I'm not, you know, not a war buff by any means, but there's something so compelling about the work that he does. And there's his name there.
So Laura, a question.
Mm-hmm.
How did he manage to do this? Because this was all happening very quickly. Did he do sketches and then paint later? And how did he manage not to be killed?
Two good questions. I've got to assume that there was no way he was actually painting while he was actively serving in the military. I think he was probably taking sketches. You know, artists are always going to have their sketchbook and getting ideas. But I think, you know, the Franco-Prussian War was very short. I think it was only about a year or so. So it wasn't like he was, you know, enlisted and fighting for many years. He returned to his career as an artist and was very well received in his day. And so I think probably, yeah, he was getting ideas and taking sketches and then painting separately from his military life. But he was sort of considered the semi-official painter of the French army. So he continued to maintain connections to the military. He undertook this project a little bit after this painting was done, where he went to Prussia and England and studied the armies there to get accurate renderings of their costumes, their military uniforms, and he produced this entire book. So, you know, the French military uniforms, all of the different European uniforms. So he was just so interested in accurate detail. So he sort of intertwined the military and art his entire life. But I have to imagine that this must have been painted in a studio where he was safe and away. He was actively serving in the military rather than there as someone to report what was happening. That was just secondary because of his background? I think so. When the Franco-Prussian War broke out in 1870, he got a staff position with one of the French generals. And so he would have been traveling with the general. I don't know if, you know, he was actively, you know, firing a cannon or anything like that, or what his role was. I'd have to look more into that. But he was traveling with the army and serving in some sense. Yeah.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah.
He makes it very clear that the ultimate result of war is death by highlighting those soldiers in the very forefront of the movie, not the movie, of the painting.
It's so cinematic, Ingrid, you're right.
Exactly. But far away, you know, far enough away from the other action that you don't miss that detail. It's very clear that the ultimate result of war is death. And it seems that he's highlighting that quite clearly.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So a literally chilling depiction of war, but really a beautifully rendered one as well at the same time. So any
Chilling.
last comments?
Chilling,
about
as we all
this?
said.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Any last
Lauren,
comments? Go ahead.
Lauren, what sense do you call this a memorial?
So this
If it
is where
is
so not necessarily a memorial in
Okay,
the sense of
okay.
commemorating a specific individual, more just thinking about Memorial Day as, you know, honoring those who have died in service of their country. So sort of looking at it in that sense. Yeah, especially because these people are, I mean, these figures, he may have known them, but they're sort of anonymous and faceless, and you know, we don't even necessarily see their faces too clearly here. So not necessarily to honor these specific individuals, I think, but to capture the essence of war and what
Very
it was like
good,
to serve.
yes.
Yeah. Okay. So this is obviously, this is the 1870s. This is before, you know, photojournalism was really, really a thing, but our final painting is, our final object is a photograph. And I'll get to there in a second. Oh, here we go. And I love this photograph. I have just stumbled upon it recently. It is in the Ringling's collection, but I hadn't ever seen it before. It's not currently on view, but I find it incredibly compelling. And this is by an artist / photojournalist who clearly has an eye for composition. So before I ramble on about this, I want to just ask you, what is going on in this image and what sort of associations does it bring for you?
Touching somebody's name.
Sorry, what was that?
Touching somebody's name, maybe there's a name engraved.
Okay, touching someone's name. So you're reading this image, this shiny image here, as something where there's a name engraved and they're reaching out to touch it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Vietnam War Memorial.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, you are absolutely right. That's the title of it, Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And what I like about it is when I looked at it first, I didn't see the title, and I first thought that people were touching a pond or a reflection of water, and that they were reaching into water and sort of looking at their own reflection. And then I realized, you know, that the angle, you know, this is someone looking down on these hands here. But yeah, I'm curious, what other impressions do you get from this powerful photograph, or other thoughts that it generates for you?
I would almost expect them, rather than just touching with a finger, to be putting their whole hand there, as in trying to get closer to that person, if it was someone that they knew.
Yeah, it looks like a mother and a father. You know, the mother's hand, the father, and maybe their son or someone very close to them. It's like a parent thing.
So you're getting that sense of the familial connections, that intimacy, and perhaps, and we can sort of read the potential gender of each hand. You know, there's the nail polish here, and then the masculine looking hand. So perhaps this is a mother and a father, and they're pointing. Exactly. And it's interesting, I think, Mary, was it you who just said, you know, you would almost imagine they'd put their whole hand and embrace if it was a closer connection. So maybe they're just reading names. Is that how you're understanding it?
Could be, yes.
Could be, yeah.
Yes. But
and
then
I think the names are so small on the memorial, an entire hand would cover many more than one name.
So maybe just by necessity of how the memorial functions.
It's cultural, isn't it?
We take a picture of it.
Yeah.
It's cultural. It's lovely. It's very poignant.
Yeah.
Very, yes.
It did.
How many of you have been to? I was going to say, how many of you have been to experience the memorial in person, and is anyone willing to share what it's like to be in front of that? I've never actually been there, so can anyone share what that's like?
It's overwhelming when you see all the names.
Well, the photo, if you've been there, many of the people that attend the memorial, it's highly emotional as the photograph captures. You know, each searches for their own loved one or friend or that they lost. And each individual that's there, if you see it, the emotion that they exhibit and how you capture it yourself as an observer, that's what makes this photo, I think, so stunning as you take a look at it, because in the simplicity of the two hands, the emotion, obviously a loved one that was lost that you see within that photo, it captures the emotion of the moment when you're there at the memorial observing others.
So for you, this really resonates with what it's like to actually be there in that heightened emotion.
Yes.
Yeah.
And especially if, in my particular case, if you know some people that actually died during the Vietnam War, how it affected their loved ones, when you see it, you look at it with that perspective as opposed to someone that observes it that perhaps did not know anyone that died in the war or was severely injured or suffered the emotional consequences associated with the war as well.
And even for those who didn't lose anyone in the war, there was just the emotional upheaval in the family during both my husband and my brother were in the service during the Vietnam War. And it was a very emotional, awful time.
Well, I would say that you have the same emotion in other ways. If you go to the Smithsonian Museum of African American History, and you see many of the exhibits there. If you go to the Holocaust Museum, there is an amazing museum in Poland to commemorate the history of the Jews in Poland. You can't go through there without crying, whether you're Jewish or not. But I would say, I'm looking at the flowers, and I don't know if the photographer put them here or if they happened to be there and the photographer was lucky, but it would not be half as good a photo that it is without those flowers. At least that's what I think.
And what is it for you that, Mary, what are the flowers, how do they function for you?
It adds to the personal meaning of the whole image. Without them, it could almost be anything if we weren't looking for that and knew that you were giving us images which related to memorials. But the fact that someone, I can't tell whether they're roses or tulips or maybe even something else, but just the way that they're also reflected along with the hands, and it adds to the whole emotion of the scene. And also visually, it would be more empty without those flowers. See the way that the line of the flowers follows the line of the woman's arm and her hand as well. It's fabulous.
Yeah, really, really beautiful photograph.
Laura, Darlene Zimmerman put in the chat at the same time Mary was saying it. It really, she feels that this could represent any memorial throughout the world.
Yeah, and thank you for making that point, Darlene, because one of the questions I wanted to pose to the group is, why do you think the artist chose to sort of eliminate the more obvious references to the Vietnam memorial? We're used to seeing that wall and the swooping or people standing in front of it, but here, right, it could be a more universal experience. And why do you think she made that choice to make it where, like you said, Mary, if I hadn't prompted you to say this is about memorial, you might not even recognize that?
I think it's because it's more personal. It's like one name, and also it's in black and white. So it's a combination of the sadness and the love these people have for that particular person, that particular name. I think it's very touchy.
Yeah, it becomes this
you can
really
feel it.
Personal but universal expression of
Yes,
grief.
exactly.
It's symbolic, whether it's that place or another one.
Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I wanted
really
to share,
good.
Isn't it a good photograph? I know. I wanted to share a little bit about the artist, Wendy Watrous. So she has a long history of being a photographer, and she works very closely with her husband, who's her collaborator. But she began photographing the effects of Agent Orange on veterans. And she had the series of photographs published in Life, and they were picked up by other high-profile, institutions or publications. But she wasn't seeing any real change come. People would see the images and they were sort of horrifying and beautiful and terrible, but nothing was happening. So she realized that there was sort of a limitation in what she could do. So she decided to take more action. So she brought these photographs as sort of this traveling exhibition. She used them at hearings in Congress, and she really got political to sort of push for increased, care for people who had been suffering the effects of Agent Orange. She really became an activist. She joined forces with the veterans she had gotten to know through photographing them, and they actually resulted in state and federal mandates to improve medical treatments for veterans. So she's this amazing woman. She's still alive. She's still photographing. And there was a quote that I came across from her that I wanted to just share. She writes, "I learned so much from the Agent Orange experience, but perhaps the most valuable lesson was having to confront the limitations of photojournalism. Even in the best of times, even when highly recognized within the field itself, our images are only tools, not an end in themselves. To practice photojournalism in a way that brings meaning and change requires photographers to think past the boundaries of this profession." And so I just wanted to sort of leave you with that today. This is a good reminder for me about the power of art, but also the power of action. So we can be moved by an image or inspired by it or horrified by it, but unless we take those emotions and translate them into something more, the power of art itself is sort of diluted. So I wanted to just leave on that note, but I'm very happy to hear additional comments from you or other questions that you may have. And I'll go back to her image because it's so beautiful.
That is a beautiful, poignant image to end a talk about memorials on.
So Laura, when might it be on display?
I'm not sure. We'd have to talk to Chris Jones, who's our photography curator. But the Searing Galleries A and B are now permanently dedicated to showing photography from our collection. So when Chris is able to rotate it in, I'm sure he will, he'll let us know.
So maybe as loyal followers of your talk, and because there are so few of us, we could perhaps have a viewing of it when we're all allowed to be with other people again.
I'll have to, my loyal followers, I'll see what I can do. Get you some behind the scenes access. I'll talk to Chris.
Or your groupies, Laura.
The groupies, yeah. Well,
there you go.
The fans of Wendy Watrous, we want to see her photograph.
I just have one comment about this photo. It's so beautiful, but I love the reflection because I think we all, when we've lost someone, we want to connect with them, and it almost makes it feel like they're connecting, which I think is poignant.
It's beautiful.
That's a really great point, Kathleen. And it really brings us back to the comments made in the first object about wanting to maintain that connection to someone even after they're gone, and how do we do that? That universal desire. Well, this is sort of a heavy topic to end on, but sometimes art is powerful like that. So I want to just thank you so much for your conversation and your participation. Really beautiful insights. I always learn something from you. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Laura.
And
thanks for finding these.
We'll see you next time.